Welcome to the New Yorker Festival. I'm Atul Gawande. I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker, a surgeon up in Boston at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and a public health researcher. And it is incredibly lucky to get to be here with all of you. Thank you for spending your Saturday morning in the dark. First of all, a note of business. Any of you wanting to use Twitter, I'm asked to notify you to use the hashtag TNYFest. Did I get that right? Yes, TNYFest. Any of you with phones, if you could silence your phones, and it's requested that there be no photography. Thank you for the chance to talk to you about a seemingly strange subject of coaching, which I got to write about this week. And the great thing about getting to do this is I get to tell some of the stories that I didn't get to put into the story. So it's a fun opportunity. But the puzzle of it is why in the world I would get interested in something like coaching. And I think there are certain fundamental themes that have been interesting to me ever since I've got the chance to start writing for the New Yorker when I was just a surgical trainee. And now it's been 12 years of getting to have my foot in this great door. And the two themes that have been of interest to me are, number one is complexity, the feeling that we are in a world that is requiring us to know more, master more, in order to make some of the most basic functions in society or the basic things that we do in our day-to-day lives feasible. The volume of information and ability you have to have just to get through the day has exploded, and it seems to only be accelerating. And then a second theme that's been of interest to me, and odd that I get to write about it, has been how I get good at what I do in the medical world, and how, maybe by extension, we all get good at what we do in the medical world or as patients. Now, these are clearly, I think, tightly connected. A lot of the reason I was interested in understanding how we get good at what we do is because it wasn't obvious to me from the textbooks that I was learning from or the classes that you take as you start entering medical training and making your way along. There was this whole unwritten part of how you just do more than just know your diseases, know how to tie knots, how to do some basic technical things. There was the world of how you cope with teams of people in an operating room or in a hospital, how you deal with the volume of knowledge you haven't even had a chance to absorb, how you deal with uncertainty, how you deal with mistakes. And all of these are crucial to getting good at what we do. And yet, none of it was really laid out in ways that I could understand. It was a kind of absorption process that was supposed to occur, and I wasn't sure if it was really happening. The process of it, though, seemed strikingly different from the world that my parents, who were both physicians, my father was a urologist, my mother is a retired pediatrician, and their world that they trained in seemed very different from the complexity of the world that I trained in. They trained in the 1960s, and then if we go back a little bit further, we come to a point where you can see just where the plane started to take off. One of my favorite authors was Lewis Thomas, a poet, a essayist, a winner of the National Book Award, and the head of Memorial Sloan Kettering here as a great infectious disease researcher. And he, in his book, The Youngest Science, wrote about what it was like to be an intern in starting out at the Boston City Hospital after he graduated from Harvard Medical School in the pre-penicillin year of 1937. And what he felt was, and what he noticed, was that for the most part, what he could do, what any physician could do, was pretty limited. That if patients got better, it had very little to do with what he could offer, and much more to do with what the nurses and the supportive care and the comfort that the hospital could provide for people who were very sick. And then if they got better or didn't, it was by virtue of the diseases and their course as much as anything else. But there were a handful of things that he could offer to certain patients. The patient who had a lobar pneumonia, they didn't have antibiotics at that time, but they did have an injection you could get from rabbits who had been injected with that kind of bacteria that causes the pneumonia. They develop antibodies, and so his job as an intern would literally be to draw up the rabbit antibodies, which were packaged in a kind of serum, try to match whether you were giving the right antibodies to the patient or not, or they'd have some kind of a terrible allergic anaphylactic reaction, and then give the patient and the injections of this rabbit serum, and that could sometimes turn people around. He could treat heart failure, and the way they treated heart failure was primarily by bleeding the patient, followed by giving them a crude leaf preparation of digitalis. He could provide treatment for syphilis by a mixture of mercury and arsenic, as long as you didn't give too much. There were a few operations they could offer on the surgical ward for certain kinds of tumors, certain kinds of infections like appendicitis and so on. But then beyond that list, that was pretty much it. Over the course of that last century, there's been an overwhelming growth of capacity and of intricacy in what people who practice medicine have to be able to do. By the time my parents trained in the 1960s, there were a couple hundred effective drugs. There were several hundred medical and surgical procedures. Today, for the 13,600 different diagnoses that human beings can have, hopefully you don't have all of them, there are 6,000 drugs and more than 4,000 medical and surgical procedures. And mastering any of it has become an extremely complicated, difficult kind of affair. What there seems to be is a mismatch between the engine of discovery, the engine that has produced a tremendous amount of knowledge and skill, and the volume of capability it's providing, and the people like me that are supposed to be able to master and deliver on it, that are supposed to be able to make it possible to get to you. And the consequences are manifold. They turn up in the morale of people who work as doctors and nurses in medicine, their feeling of being overwhelmed at times, running harder and harder. Some of the hardest working people there are in our society, working longer hours, and yet feeling less and less effective in certain ways, even though the capabilities have grown. It turns up in the experiences of patients who feel like I've got a specialist who knows this and a specialist who knows that, but they don't talk to each other. It doesn't make sense, and I don't know if I can trust them to know what they're supposed to know, because I go on the internet and I find 5 things that they don't even seem to be aware of. And it turns up in our economy in the way that it's wrecking the process of trying to generate that capability, make it accessible to people, and not make what's necessary unaffordable to people, is slowly bankrupting, and now quickly bankrupting everything from family budgets to state budgets to the federal government. Part of the reflection of this is in the last decade, some numbers came out just a couple of weeks ago showing that the average family of four, the median family of four, who has insurance and a job, earned over this last decade $23,000 more per year than they had 10 years ago. But all but $95 a month of that has gone to paying for the healthcare bills, gone for paying for that engine of growth and capability that we all want to be able to have access to. Now, the other striking thing to me about it is I don't think that that experience of growing capability, knowledge, volume of information, complexity of skill is any different in virtually any other part of what people do in society to make basic necessities of society work. That the acceleration of knowledge and capability has pushed us to the limit across multiple areas of work. In science areas like engineering and technical areas like software and so on, but then also in places like teaching or just trying to make the government work or trying to deal with the legal system and everything else. The main difference in healthcare has just been very vividly has lives on the line. And at the moment, it's taking up a fifth of our economy, and that's become a huge source of pressure. But everywhere, what we see are ordinary people, no different than in any other century, who are trying to do extraordinary things that societies don't say, have never said are part of what are required to live in the world. We have ordinary people who have to be able to operate on you, to be able to go inside and address problems that there's knowledge about how to do it, but difficult to execute. There are people trying to teach math concepts to 8th graders that Euclid would have had a hard time grappling with. There are people building skyscrapers and highways. There's creating information systems. There's all of the parts of a modern society that depends on getting things right. Spent past few years thinking a lot about these concepts and distilling some of it into ideas around checklists. Not what I thought I would be spending a significant chunk of my time on when I'd come out of 10 years of training in, 12 years of training in medical school and surgery. If you'd have told me that I would spend huge chunks, maybe the majority of my time outside the operating room, even more time than I spend on writing on things like what would be the checklist for a child delivery and what would be the checklist for a terminally ill patient, I would have said, that's crazy. I want to work on something exciting. But as we've become clear that the mastery of complexity and of complex organizations requires groups of people trying to make sure they at least get the basics right, it's turned out that something like a checklist is a very powerful and interesting tool for understanding how you cope with brains that can only hold so much information and people who don't necessarily talk to one another when they're supposed to talk to one another. And as we sort of followed the footsteps of people in fields like aviation and made checklists for something like an operation, we found over and over again we were cutting death rates 20%, 40%, 50%, and started recognizing that this could be one of the basic tools that we need to incorporate into a wide variety of areas where we're just not used to taking people who are really smart, well-trained, highly professional, know what they're doing, and then saying to them, there might be something you could use and do that would make you even better. And that's where that concept comes in. It's when the pilot has the checklist in hand and says, even though I've flown planes for 25 years, this will make me even better. And in a plane, it also means it makes it more likely I won't die along the way. That's the simplest form. That's the basics, thinking about what a checklist might get you to do. But what about doing more than the basics? What about trying to get at excellence? So a few years ago, having tried creating things like checklists, I made checklists and began using them in my own operating room, saw things continue to improve. I've been in practice now 8 years, but then having adopted that, I found that I was flatlining. I had experienced through almost everything I've done in my career and growth has been that I always was getting to learn and do better at whatever I was trying to do. So in medicine, as I'm working my way through medical school, each year I seemed to be better than the last. As I went through surgical training, each year I seemed to be better than the last. As I entered into my surgical practice, then there was this huge learning curve and steep rise, and I would watch the complication rates for my patients go down and my success rates go up one year after the other, and I felt very good about that. I felt like I had reached the point where I was beating all the averages. But 8 years in, for the last couple years, I'd just been like this. Nothing getting strikingly better. And it makes you wonder, is this the peak? Is this it? Is it only downhill from here? And you think about careers and the way that different kinds of careers go. Pop singers peak before the age of 30. Mathematicians supposedly do their best work before the age of 30. On the other hand, CEOs, and for whatever reason, geologists, tend to be in their mid-50s when they're at the peak of their careers. My supposition is that it's people who are dealing with people or nature that requires a set of complex skills that make it so that you're rising at your peak much later in life. And surgery falls somewhere in between. It's a very physical profession. You're on your feet for 12 hours during a day. You have certain kinds of manual skills you have to have, but you also get great benefit from accumulation of experience and judgment, and that those intersecting curves cross somewhere around my age, I think. And so my puzzle was, is there any likelihood that this changes or gets better? The thing that got me thinking, as I explained in this recent article, was I am an avid tennis player. I used to think I could be a competitive tennis player as a teenager. I'd play tournaments. My mother, however, pointed out that I lack a killer instinct. And so I tended to go so far, but at a certain point I just didn't want to kill the other guy. I'd sympathize if they were sort of not doing so well. And also really hated running and lifting. I liked it plenty if there was. I like anything that has a score, but when it came to just doing the weightlifting and the running, that part of it was not going to be in it for me. And so I rapidly found that I could get good enough to make my way to the under 16s in a national tournament and get to the first round and then lose 6-0, 6-1 because I wasn't remotely playing the game that other people were playing. And so when the choices came to go to college, I could have played on a scholarship for a small college tennis team, or I could have gone to Stanford and with the number one tennis team in the world, but Stanford. And so I went to Stanford knowing that this was the end of ever really playing tennis again. And then for the last many years have just been coping with the gradual decline in my game and just trying to slow it down, try to, at least not make it incredibly fast. And so I will take my tennis racket with me on trips, not to New York City for some reason. I don't imagine getting on a court anywhere around here. And I went and was at a medical conference, and there was an afternoon free, and I went to look for someone to play with. And at a local private club, there was no one to play with. They had a ball machine. They won't let you play with the ball machine unless you belong to the club. But there was a pro there who said, well, I'll hit with you, but you got to pay for a lesson. I'm like, okay, $125 for some kid who just graduated from college. This is crazy, but I'll do it. And he was good. He ran me around. He was able to tire me out within about 30 minutes. And then we started, taking some serves just to practice a little. Maybe even play a game or two where he could kill me. And he noticed my serve could be improved. And so he started going into coach mode, and what he noticed was something I'd never noticed in all the time I'd served before, which is that when I served, and I had my right foot going behind me, it dragged a little bit behind me. I was a few inches behind, which meant that the power wasn't going up into the serve quite the way I could have made it go. And with a few minutes of tinkering, he added about 10 miles an hour to my serve. The serve was the best part of my game growing up. And I was, by the end of that now lesson, serving harder than I'd ever served as a teenager. And I didn't think anything of that until I was watching tennis on the Tennis Channel and noticed that Rafael Nadal had a coach. I mean, I knew he had a coach, but it struck me that even the best tennis player in the world, now number 2, Djokovic, also has a coach, has a coach. And I would never imagine paying $125 an hour for someone to come into my operating room and watch me operate. I would never imagine asking anyone to do it unpaid. And that seemed really interesting to me. We have 2 paradigms for how we get good at what we do in the world. We have a teaching paradigm and we have a coaching paradigm. Teaching is, is the way that violinists and surgeons learn, and coaching is the way that athletes or, say, opera singers learn. Coaching is the notion that let me start with the teaching. The teaching notion is you graduate. You have to get some basic skills. You have to develop proficiency. And then, so if you're a violinist, you go to Juilliard. You get to a certain level, and then you graduate. You go out and get your 10,000 hours of experience. The cream rises to the top. A few people are able to improve themselves to the point of becoming the Itzhak Perlmans of the world. Completely different from the coaching point of view. The coaching point of view is you never get good enough to not need guidance along the way. There is no graduation. At every step, you need someone who is literally watching what you do, giving you guidance, helping you reach new goals, and that's what you need to do to get where you're going. I was especially struck with the idea that in the music world, the violinists who go to Juilliard abandon having any teacher anymore, and the opera singers don't. So I called up Itzhak Perlman to ask him about this, and weirdly he answered my call. It's really great. And it was this great hour-and-a-half long conversation that just went back and forth, and he was asking me as many questions about how surgery teaching works as I was asking him. And I got to the key question I wanted to ask him, which was, why do athletes and opera singers have coaches and a musician who graduates from Juilliard doesn't? A violinist or a viola player. And his answer was, I don't know, but it's a mistake. At least for him, he said he'd had a coach through his entire career. His wife, Toby, he'd graduated from Juilliard with. And she had spent her career in the audience, watching him play, and watching for the fine details that mattered. He was becoming quickly very, very good. But he said to become what he became, and what he became is really very likely the greatest violinist of his generation. He needed that outside ear that she could provide. He needed someone who could see the fine detail, that a section might be too fast, that he seemed too mechanical, that there were ideas and problems that he could practice at and solve. For the world of getting to that level, this is what he seemed to require. And he didn't know if others in his profession functioned that way, but he suspected that they all had their private ways of finding maybe family, friends, old teachers, connections, who could see them and get them that extra nuance that they could not see themselves, the external ear and the external eyes that could tell them what to do. I wondered if that could apply in the sort of ordinary things that we do. And I learned about this concept called teacher coaching. It's a field that evolved out of the recognition that the most important thing about improving the results of education for our kids in schools, the most significant determinant that's in the control of the school is the quality of teaching. It's not how much standardized testing they do. It's not the size of the classroom. It's simply the quality of teaching that matters far more than those sorts of things in explaining the results of students as they go on. It's the kind of thing you know from looking at your own kids. I can see the difference between when one of my kids has a great teacher and another one has a sort of, and then they go to another class and it's been a mediocre teacher. And it really doesn't seem to have anything to do with the size of that class at all. There was a series of studies suggesting that coaching might be, in fact, the most successful way to bring and breed more of those folks. The ways that we try to create better teaching have primarily been carrot and stick approaches. You reward the great teachers financially, and we want to be able to fire the bad ones. But we have thought very little about how you develop that capability and see that as the central part of what we're trying to do. And there's a guy named Jim Knight at the University of Kansas who runs a program called the Kansas Coaching Project. And what he has done for the last 2 decades is teach coaches who go in and try to coach teachers in the classroom about how to get better results in what they do. And it was stemmed from a series of studies that were done primarily in California in the 80s that were randomized trials looking at how to improve the results that teachers got. And what they found was that when you're trying to teach people better skills at, say, teaching math or teaching writing, that there are certain concepts that are already known that teachers can master for doing those things well. And the usual way that we try to give people those skills is we make them take workshops, a weekend workshop or a course or things like that. And the results of those have been consistently over and over again that 6 months later, only 10 or 15% of the teachers are actually using those skills in the classroom. But when they did a randomized trial and had those teachers, in addition to being taught in a classroom or in a workshop what to do, had them coached with someone who came once every couple weeks just to see how they were doing in the classroom, give them a little bit of feedback on their progress with what they were doing, the rate of uptake of those skills was better than 80%. In some studies, better than 90%. It was night and day. And it started to make some sense. No matter how seemingly simple a set of new skills might be, when you try to take it into your own world and use them, it's sometimes just not a fit, and it doesn't go well, or you don't quite get it, or there's a, you still need to get some confidence with it. And those initial failures are enough to lead you to not try it at all. Or you try it and it doesn't work and you drop it altogether. Whereas the person who just comes in and says, how's it going? Well, actually, I hadn't tried it yet. All right. Well, I'll check in again in another couple weeks and then tell me how it goes. Moves people off of that inertia. And then when they have trouble, you have someone who says, this is something that I've tried to be able to fix that. You can move your right foot back just a few inches, and it adds 10 miles an hour to your serve. What it is that improvement, as the performance researchers have shown, comes from taking unconscious incompetence, bringing it to conscious incompetence, and then when you're aware of the problem, bringing you to conscious competence, and then getting you so familiar and comfortable with mastering a new set of capabilities that it just becomes part of your unconscious competence. And that cycle is what we all go through over and over again as we begin trying anything that's hard to do. The key in the middle of that is that when you are now when you're conscious of what you are incompetent at, what you're not quite good enough at, is that there's deliberate practice that you have to engage in. That's a technical term that Kay Anders Ericsson, the performance researcher who's quite famous in this field, has identified, that makes the difference between people who get great results and people who don't. There's talent, absolutely, to be sure. But there is no talent that comes ready-made with perfection at the kinds of complex skills that there are out in the world, whether it's basketball or tennis or teaching in a classroom or trying to do an operation. Deliberate practice is taking someone who has a set of talents and getting that person to practice deliberately at what they are not good at. And what people who are great at what they do are really good at is practicing at the stuff that they weren't good at, finding it, identifying it, and being able to cycle through, be able to do that. The teaching model has believed that you can figure that out for yourself. That after you've become a professional, someone who's gotten your degree, that you can make the rest of your way on your own. And the coaching model says that's incredibly naive. It is unconscious failure that's the source of the problem, and you need the external eyes and ears to help you become aware of where you are. If I'm plateauing in the middle of my career, it's because I've tried my bag of tricks and then run out of stuff that I can do. The ability then rests on being able to have someone or some way to know, to learn, to become aware of where those failures are, and then to work towards them. It also, I think, comes from an understanding that we all have a hard time with, which is that details matter much more than we necessarily think or understand. I loved the story that I ran across in trying to research the article of John Wooden, the UCLA basketball coach, who every season would start his new squad off with practicing putting their socks on. And he would not even let them put on their socks. First, he would show them exactly how you put on the socks, that you would start at the feet and you'd pull the socks in and make sure that the socks are tightly around the toes, and then pull it up around the heel and then around the ankle and then up all the way to the calf, and then you go back and you smooth the surface out so there are absolutely no wrinkles in it at all. And he had two reasons that he tried to do that. Number one, he wanted them to understand that wrinkles create blisters, and blisters cost games. But more than that, he wanted them to understand that every detail matters, and that becoming great at what they do required them to be able to grasp all of the ones that mattered along the way. A great coach, like a Wooden, was someone who could see the details that could help create success. I asked Jim Knight, the coach, teacher, the coach of coaches, to show me what good coaching really looked like, John Wooden-style coaching. And he brought me to Albemarle County, Virginia, where they had a coaching program for teachers. And it was interesting just to understand the structure of how it even works. They assigned basically about one teacher per school who no longer was in the front of the classroom, but now was going to be in the back of the classroom coaching people. They would typically not be mandated except for the teachers who in their first couple years of teaching. For the rest of the teachers, it was open to them, and they would come about once every couple weeks and simply watch teachers as they taught. The success of that program, what made it good coaching, was partly the stuff that happened even before the coach ever went to the classroom. They set it up there, and they don't always do that everywhere that they've got school coaches. They set it up there so that it was for the teachers. The principal was on the same page. He was fully behind it. But these were not his spies going into the classroom. The evaluations, the judgments that a coach came to never were going to reach the principal. And so the teachers could actually believe, and it still took time for them to trust and believe that this was actually for them. They'd seen so much bait and switch before that it took time to build up the trust and belief that that actually was the case. And then furthermore, when they went in the classroom, they did not say, okay, I'm here to help you teach, and here's what I want you to work on. You're going to need to do this. They went in and said, what do you want to work on? Because the teachers generally had a far more consistent and nuanced idea of where their difficulties were than someone just watching them for the very first time. There was a kind of menu of things that they needed to work on. They understood how to break it down and how to help someone arrive at what they wanted to think about doing. And I'll give you an example. One of the classrooms that I watched was a biology classroom, a science classroom, where they were teaching evolution. The teacher was someone who had been teaching for about 15 years or more. And that particular day, they were working on understanding what traits were and what the differences were between behavioral traits and structural traits that evolve in animals. We're in the South. I thought this was sort of interesting. I asked the teacher afterwards, do you ever get backlash for teaching evolution? He said, I've been teaching it 15 years. You get a parent who complains once in a while. I tell them, we're teaching evolution, and it's never a problem. I think we sometimes are so swayed by the stories of the extremes that we can forget that in ordinary communities, in fact, this is the normal experience of teaching things that are still controversial at a national level. And so for her problem wasn't going to be whether she was allowed or needed to couch the evolutionary discussion. It was, how do I get these concepts across? And she had a class of about 30 students. It was incredibly busy. It struck me as chaotic. Kids would sometimes shout out answers and throw their hands up and start talking even before they'd been called upon. She had a combination of pictures and PowerPoint presentation of is this a behavioral trait or a structural trait? You know, if there was a peacock that was male and that was very colorful, and had a certain way of trying to court. Do you call that behavioral? Do you call that structural? How do you be able to weave all of that together? By the end, then she had them try out something where they could understand what the significance of evolving a certain trait would be by taping the hands of, breaking into groups, and one of the students would tape the thumbs of the other student, and they would time themselves in doing certain kinds of tasks to be able to figure out whether you really need thumbs or not, and what's the significance of an opposable thumb. I thought it was okay teaching. The classroom seemed really chaotic to me, and they were only halfway through doing their measurements when the bell rang and the students went running out the door, and there was a whole mess left behind. And I'd been in a math classroom that was run like clockwork, this followed by this followed by this, and then they were out the door, and it was all completely regimented. And so I asked the coaches whether that's what they saw, and in fact, they said that was remarkably well done, because their ultimate metric was, did the students understand the concepts? And along the way, she'd been able to find some way of noticing whether in a classroom of 30 kids, whether every single student had gotten the concept. And by the time they were out the door, she knew they had. She knew that they all had. And she'd done it in different ways, using hands-on techniques, which some kids were going to learn better by, visual, written tests, little quiz in the middle of it, and it was really sort of a remarkable thing. So when we sat down with her afterwards for a kind of 20-minute coaching discussion, it started the usual way: what went well, what didn't go well. Their primary tool is the question. They had reams of notes, but they needed to be able to address a couple of things. To them, her issue was time management. They didn't mind the chaos if she was comfortable with the chaos, and the students had high energy and got the concepts. But she wasn't able to get to everything that she wanted to be able to accomplish in that class. And so the question was, how could she work on the time management? But they wanted to hear that from her, because the biggest difficulties are two things in a great coach. Number one is understanding which details matter, seeing the nuance and what the goals are, and then how you get there. How do you break it down into the component parts? They had broken down in their heads that for teaching, it's a combination of time management and student behavior regulation, but also planning that class well, being able to use kind of learning tools that get at all the different ways the students learn, and then being able to assess and know where are your students and then correct for those situations. It's an incredibly complex enterprise. You're trying to get students in a 50-minute to a 90-minute class, depending on their blocks during their day, to accomplish certain things. And they had ways of working on each of those components as they went along. Well, you could break it down. You could say time management, and there are 3 things that you could really work on. You could give it to someone, and they can say, who do you think you are telling me to do this? Have you ever taught science? The 2 coaches that were coaching were a former history teacher, 33 years old, and at least a decade and a half younger than this teacher who'd been teaching a long time. And the other was Diane Harding, a woman who was a technology specialist and had been out of the classroom for the previous 7 years working on the computer systems for the schools. So who do you think you are to tell me what I might be doing to work on in how I teach evolution? And half of the trick of the coach is understanding how you be able to do that. Itzhak Perlman, when I was talking to him, he said, one of the things Toby, his wife, understands is that afterwards, when I ask her how did it go, that she's supposed to say, it was great. He says for 30 minutes after a concert, that's all he can hear. And then later, they can talk about, but there was this one part. And in a similar way, they understood when talking to this teacher, this science teacher, what to say to get her at ease. What did you think went well? What did you think was worth working on? And she very quickly recognized, I didn't get to all the stuff I wanted to get to. Everybody got the concepts, but I had one more thing I wanted to be able to get to. And then they said, well, how are we going to solve that? And she was sort of at a wall. She said, I don't know, I have this problem all the time. And they then just talked through, like colleagues, for 15 minutes, what were the things that she might try next time to be able to make it go. And they came up with a couple of things. Her PowerPoint presentation had 18 slides, and she really shouldn't expect you could get through all that many. And in truth, the kids who are going to learn from visuals, we're only going to need 8 or 9. And so, next time, try cutting down that number. A lot of it was in the pre-planning, and she hadn't pre-planned with time management in mind. And so she thought for the next couple of weeks, that's what she's going to work on. She felt good about her ability to do the other things, but for the next couple of weeks, she'd see if she could get her agenda done and planned well enough to get through. When I talked with her about it afterwards, she gave me the same response that the other teachers had been giving me. They loved having this coach. They felt they were getting better. That was part of it. But the other part of it was, it just was more satisfying. These were people who've been teaching a long time and had no allies. The classroom, hello? The classroom is actually a strangely lonely place. And when one of the teachers said that, it really rang home for me, because the operating room and the clinic are places that feel exactly like that. There is nowhere that's more isolated in the world than when that door shuts. I've never had a senior surgeon or someone come in to my operating room or to my clinic and say, here, what do you want to work on? Here's what I see. Someone who really tried to raise my sights on what I could do. And so I decided to give this idea a try and asked one of my colleagues, Bob Osteen, a surgeon who'd retired as a surgical oncologist, he did cancer surgery, several years before, but had, when I was in training, won the teaching award year after year, and just was this amazing teacher, someone who taught primarily by forcing you to think. His constant trick was to say nothing when you'd operate with him and do nothing. He'd just kind of stand there and wait for you to make the first move. If it was a really bad move, he'd go, And if it was within the realm of tolerability, he would let you proceed, and you'd start by having to mark where the incision's going to be, and you'd look up at him. Does this look? And what was so uncomfortable about this silent person standing across the room was he was forcing you to think. And when I asked him, he was very happy to come into the classroom, into my operating room, and watch me operate. He didn't do very many of the operations that I do. I'm a cancer surgeon as well in 3/4 of my practice, doing specialized cancers of the thyroid and adrenal glands, and in particular. And then in the other quarter of my practice, just doing general surgery, mostly for emergencies that can range from appendicitis to colon problems and so on. And he watched me doing some of my thyroid operations and adrenal operation and so on. And these weren't techniques and things that he really had tried to master himself. And so I wondered what he really could offer in the way of guidance. And afterwards, after our first operation, I actually thought it went extremely well. But he had a dense notepad of comments to make. And he said something that was very crucial, is that if I want to get to the point, so my complication rate's about 2%. 2% of my patients have a serious harm that occurs. And if I want to get to the point that it's 1 in 100 instead of 2 in 100, it's all the small stuff that matters. There's only small things that we had to work on, but the small stuff is the crucial stuff. And then he went on to point out the little things that he had noticed, that when I'm operating, I operate with magnifying loops to see the nerves and everything I want to find, but that means I'm not aware of everything going on around the room, and that there was a certain problem that the nurse was having with some of the equipment, that the anesthesiologist had a blood pressure problem during part of the operation. And I was oblivious to it because I was in my tunnel. I also didn't notice that the lights had swung out of the wound for 30 minutes of the case, and I was getting light only off of reflected surfaces with only half of the visual luminosity that you would like to have, and didn't notice it. He had comments about the way my elbow tended to go up in the air at certain points in the operation when I was doing something awkward, and that you can't be precise with your elbow in the air, that you should be rested and at your side, so it means you need to either move your feet or choose a different instrument that lets you get in that position. And just step by step, now we've been meeting for more than a year. And with a once-a-month kind of visit like this and experimenting with it, I've asked him to comment on how I manage things in the clinic, how I plan the operations. We're also working on how I teach. It's been an extraordinary thing because my complication rates have gone down when I thought I had peaked. There's significance, I think, to this. It's just still an anecdote. But the experience of coaching is not an anecdote. It is widespread in multiple fields, and it's quite apparent in multiple fields, and I have no reason to think that medicine or law or teaching or others are any different in the difficulties that people have in coping with the complexity of what being good at what they do requires. That is to say, we all need our external eyes and ears to see where we're struggling, to ask us those questions. What went well? What didn't go well? What do we work on? And how do you start thinking through how to solve what needs to be done? A lot of this doesn't necessarily have ready-made recipes, because at a certain point, you're also trying to be creative about what you're doing. I love the story of the Fosbury flop, where Bob Fosbury was the famous high jumper who, for whatever reason, on his own, decided to start changing his technique of going over the high bar. And instead of doing the traditional way, which is a scissors technique going leg up, face down, he sort of wanted to go over like a salmon going up the stream, head first, back down. His coaches would tell him, "That's crazy, that is not how you do things." And so on his own, he would practice doing it. And in competitions, he would start reverting to the salmon technique, the Fosbury flop as it got to be known. And finally, the coaches gave up because he kept getting higher and higher. And then at the 1968 Mexico Olympics, he set an Olympic record, won the gold, and because it was on worldwide television, it changed high jumping overnight. Coaching is not about giving you the menu, the recipes. It's about being able to foster the ability of people to maximize their own capabilities, to maximize their own potential. And as we try to face a world where we are coping with complexities that I think no society has come close to having to cope with. The complexities of being a large nation, mastering flows of information that are nothing like we've ever had before, a discovery engine that has produced capabilities across numerous lines of work, but a front end, ordinary people at the coalface of work who are expected to pull off mastering all these things and offered little more than carrots and sticks, I think we can only expect it's going to fail. It's going to do no better than in that world where there is some weekend workshop for a teacher saying, here's what teaching great writing is all about. Now go do it next year. In medicine, it's very relevant because we're in the midst of an enormous and very rapid change. We've been in a world that has paid us for doing widgets, paid for the quantity of care that we provide, indifferent to the results that we might get. For any operation I do, I get a certain amount of money. The more I do, the more I make. And if there are complications, it's only my professional ethic that has demanded that this make a difference. There's not even good statistics about who has poor results and who has better results, so that for the most part, patients don't necessarily know. If you have an adequate reputation, it's just making the widgets go. And we are, because of the way healthcare is bankrupting the economy, going through an extraordinarily rapid change where people are shifting to being paid on salaries, being employed by health systems, or are being parts of organizations where we are now responsible for not just how many widgets did you do, but did your patient end up in the emergency room for reasons that they shouldn't have ended up in the emergency room? Are you making sure that they have all of the prevention and all of the kinds of steps in care that should be there? Are you able to work with teams of people to ensure that your patients don't fall through the cracks, get great service? And these are concerns that I'm sure many of you have experienced when you go to your doctors, aren't necessarily the ones that they've ever talked with you about, been responsible for. How many of you have had an elderly parent and needed to try to get the doctors just to talk to one another about the gazillion things that have gone wrong and just explain it to you and then to one another so you could just get on the same page? We're now not just expected, but reaching a point of being rewarded. There are carrots and sticks going into place. And the expectation is we will know how to do this. We just needed to have the right incentives. I completely believe the incentives have been perverse and prevent us from having great care. They reward the teams that do the highly profitable imaging or operations. They don't reward the primary care doctor who is able to make sure that the whole system is supposed to work for the patient the way it should, and do their best to keep them on the right path for being healthy. They don't reward the teams of people for lowering their costs along the way. And if we are now entering this world and expect that the incentives will not cause harm and have a 1980s backlash where people just feel like my doctor didn't send me to the emergency room and now and something terrible has gone wrong, the only way I think we are going to get there is by understanding how we help people in mastering new skills in the middle of their careers when they're already pretty good at what they do and have never had to make such massive changes. And that's where I think concepts like coaching comes in. The opportunities go, I think, beyond medicine, and they go beyond medicine in another way, which is that we have a huge pool of baby boomers who are about to retire and take their knowledge of what success in their work really is with them. And the kind of feeling of usefulness that Bob Osteen, who could come out of retirement, spend a day, a month coming back to the operating room and being of incredible service the feeling that that had for him, I said, I'll pay you. He said, are you kidding? I'll pay you. We're missing these connections. And I think we miss them because we undervalue them. We seem to be in a place where the most important thing to us is the economics. I don't want to underestimate the power of economics, but it is not the only thing. Everywhere in the experience of our economy is just people touching people, whether it's in education, in healthcare, in a law office, in many walks of our lives. And we've lost sympathy for those people at that front end. We've lost attention to how hard those jobs have become. We brand the teachers who want to keep bargaining rights in Wisconsin lazy, and we brand doctors when infections spread as purely inept. To some extent, all of these things can be found. There are inept doctors, and all of us in medicine are inept at certain points in time as well. But having sympathy for the complexity of what we're trying to pull off in society leads us to recognize that we are full of people who are just ordinary people trying to do extraordinary things. And making it possible for them to be more successful is going to be our most powerful innovation over time. The place we've come, I think, is also affected by how we're thinking we exist in our world. How do I explain this? It not only requires sympathy for the people who are kind of at the coalface doing the work, it also requires some understanding that we have to have a comfort level with failure. That imperfection is not as much an opportunity for outrage as it is an opportunity for solving a new problem. We have entire societies around the world now that are driven by a belief that they're not good enough, but they can be better. When I visit the home of my parents and go to India, when you see China, when you see many other places, what you see are societies that are frustrated by the fact that they aren't where they think they could be compared to other countries. But they're also not without hope. They both believe that they can be better and that they're not good enough. And I'm not sure whether we're there, whether we're a place that is willing to say, we're not good enough, but we can be better. At times it's verboten to suggest that we're anything less than the best in the world at anything that we do, and yet at the same time to be utterly pessimistic that we can solve any problem that there might be. The story of the last 2 centuries, it seems to me, of American life has been that pragmatic spirit that we can be better. We're eager to be better. We're eager to find new ways. Combined with a real interest in that front place where people actually touch people. Coaching is just a kind of a funny and interesting idea, but deep inside it is some sense that there is hopefulness that comes from understanding our detailed world of how you do an operation, how you teach an 8th grader, and passing along those skills, understanding them and writing about them. One of the strange things to me is I feel like I have that territory as a writer to myself. In medicine, we have had 2 years of healthcare reform upheaval. We have hundreds of reporters covering Washington and the ups and downs of the political fights. But weirdly, what I'm grateful to the New Yorker for is it lets me tell the story that there should be a lot more people describing, which is how does the world of people trying to get better at making sure care works and does not bankrupt the economy, how does that actually work? And what are the components that get us going forward? The exciting thing to me is that I do get to do this. I do get to have that little foot in the door here at the New Yorker, and that you will show up on a Saturday morning to hear about some of these ideas. And I think the more interesting thing is there's got to be more. There's got to be more opportunity for people beyond me who are telling these stories, not just in healthcare, but in everything that we're doing. Thank you for coming. I'd be delighted to take your questions. There are microphones coming down, and if you don't mind coming to the microphones up front, please make the questions brief so we have the best chance of getting to as many questions as we can, and I'll do my best to try to be succinct with my answers because I can ramble. Let's start over here.
Dr. Gawande, so I see you having two mediums to take your ideas and try to help change healthcare reform. I work for an insurance company, and I can see very much that if we were to go to doctors and say, hey, there's this great idea, we need coaches, right? It'd be that, well, who do you think you are, right? So what do you think are some of the more creative ways? How are we going to get this message? How are we going to...
There's a great experience I had, which was about not long after reform passed, our chief of general surgery sent around an email saying things are going to change and we probably have to think about how to look at some of our costs. So one of the areas I pulled out was that when we do hernia operations, we have a certain kind of mesh that goes in, and the biggest avoidable or variable cost when we do hernia operations is the kind of mesh that we put in. And for the 25 surgeons who do hernia repairs, it turned out that there was a range in the mesh we used from $123 to $15,000. Different by each surgeon. The most common one that was used was $500. And the biggest difference between the $500 one and the $123 one was that the $500 one was a piece of mesh that was cut into a funny little shape that we like when we put them into patients. And the one surgeon who used the $123 mesh cut it himself. And so in the course of that emails that went back and forth, we all decided that we'd have our colleague, Dr. Brooks, show us how he cut the little mesh, and we'd switch to the $123 mesh. And I thought about, like, in that afternoon, we had cut 80% out of one of the major chunks of the variable costs in a hernia operation in an afternoon. And if an insurance company had said, you have to use this mesh and cut it yourself, we'd be like, who the do you think you are telling me how to, I got to cut this mesh, Jesus. And even if the chief of surgery had told us this, we would have told him where he could go, because he's not a guy who does hernia operations. The ingenuity to be able to come up with the idea is what sits there. Every doctor knows how to take 15 or 20% out of their costs overnight. And with a little bit of help, could execute on it very well. But getting that creative energy to be as interested in that as we have been in understanding how to get more money out of the insurers is the world of change. Now, some of that is just changing the incentives and being able to say, hey, we're going to reward you for being able to think your way through these kinds of problems. And all of that is going on right now with insurers now rapidly changing to, first it was 1%, and then it's become 10%, and now it's 20% of your fees and reimbursement being guided by the quality of your results and your and whether you're getting better at dealing with the costs. A lot of the measures and metrics are kind of crude and don't work very well, and I think also create a certain amount of backlash when they're badly done, and they make people uninterested in how making them work well. So I do think that the incentives are really still where we start. We're in this phase of moving to what people call accountable care organizations, which is to say organizations that are kind of prepaid for taking care of a population of patients or having incentives for keeping those costs down and then getting to keep any money that they save. But people still don't know quite how to do it. I think over the next couple of years, we are going to know how to do it. And my concern more is that what comes out of that is still great care. So I think we're going to get the incentives right over the next few years. But making sure that those incentives translate into actually better care for people. People recognizing, yeah, we can cut the mesh, and it really is fine, and that we're following the data and making sure that we aren't seeing some unexpected jump in infections or anything else along the way, that knowing that information is the key. So the mix that comes together in my mind are, yeah, we're going to change the way people are paid. We're going to be able to start thinking about how we walk people through making changes in looking at problems. But the third part is information. We've simply never known. One of the questions I asked our chief of general surgery was, well, how do you know this is the most significant variable cost in our hernia operations? He said, I don't know. I'm kind of guessing. I think that is. Then I asked our suppliers to give us the printout of the costs and so on. But the people who really know what our patients' costs are you guys. You know what you're paying on the bills. And I have no idea whether when I do an operation, I know my complication rates are low and I'm driving them lower. But am I also the most expensive guy for a patient with a thyroid cancer, coming in for care, or am I actually being really effective in doing it? And if I'm not one of the least expensive overall, I bet you I could figure out how to get to there if I could know it along the way. So it's that combination of things. Guiding people with their skills, having some incentives, but especially just plain old having information. Over here.
Dr. Gawande, thank you so much for your checklist and now this recipe for excellence. I've been a business coach for a number of years. I work with some of the largest corporations in the world, and I will tell you that at this time I've never seen such dysfunction.
In business?
In business. And my question to you is, do you realize how subversive you are?
Why do you say subversive?
Okay, I've got two reasons. I've been thinking about it the entire time you were talking. Number one, it's because you're advocating a cultural paradigm. Number one, what gets in the way of coaching? Professional arrogance. This idea that I've been trained, I know this, I'm making millions and millions of dollars. Who could ever tell me?
And that's the biggest dysfunction you see when you walk into businesses, is arrogance.
Arrogance, and with that is this idea that I have to fill my time up all the time to show how important I am, as opposed to I need to take some time out to reflect on what it is I'm doing. And that's what a coaching
Well, that's where it's a little unfair, and I appreciate your question. It's a little unfair because one of the ways I get to take a little bit of time to reflect is I get to be at the New Yorker. So I get a certain amount of my time where I'm rewarded by you guys coming along for stepping back and reflecting on what I'm doing. And I'm not sure that I would enjoy surgery without the writing. I think I would have burned out pretty quickly. Whereas it is really a joyful thing to be part of my life because I get to step back and reflect on it and build that time in. Now, in a widget factory, because you're paid for every 15 minutes you keep on doing this stuff, the result is I make less money on my surgery practice. But as we move to salary and other ways of doing things, then what gets part of your time is not just being the churn it out factory, but you actually have to make it part of our lives, that we are reflecting on what we do and using the time that we're not in the operating room or in the teaching world, in the classroom and so on, make that time, build in that time to be effective in being able to make that well. Now, how how much time is enough time? Is it 15 minutes a week, or a half day a week, or I need a whole day a week for my planning time? These are more battles to be fought.
And one last thing, if I may. I think the other thing you're saying that's subversive, you're saying the means do justify the ends. And that the ends that you're talking about are ones that have to be articulated as clearly as a checklist.
Well, thank you.
Hello, I'm Michael DeVita. I'm a critical care physician, and I've been using simulation techniques to train both teamwork skills and individual skills. And in my experience doing that, I've become a huge fan of the checklist culture and the coaching culture. And the problem I've run into is a necessary outgrowth of both. When you use checklists, you constrain activities and create a rigidity. We have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And coaching is more about exploring the nuances and how do we improve. And there's a tension in there of how much do you enforce checklists and how do you still enable ingenuity and innovation. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, let me try it this way. There is a radical change in just what you're doing, because when you talk about, you said you're in cardiology?
Critical care.
Or critical care. So when you talk about simulating a really, really sick patient and all the things that need to happen, and critical care is really interesting. I had a statistic that I had cited in the book, and I already forget, from the Israeli engineering study where engineers looked at how many decisions have to be made in a typical intensive care patient, and it's something like 40 decisions an hour or something like that. It's a crazy number. And you get any one of them wrong, and you've harmed the patient instead of helping them along the way. And part of what is the checklist culture is saying, well, a lot of those decisions are ones you should not put your brain on, that should be just part of the default. And then you focus in and the creativity and innovation on the ones that are the crucial ones where you really need to be applying your judgment. There is a mix in everything that we do. There is stuff that is proven that should not be what you spend time making judgments about. Giving an antibiotic for certain situations, making sure that a patient has prevention of blood clots and so on. But you have certain kinds of problems that require people talking together, recognizing, is there an exception here that makes something different? And I think that's where these two cultures, instead of clashing, reinforce one another. The checklist for making sure the basics get done and you don't have to think about it, and the coaching to get good at thinking about all the stuff that does require creativity and has to be able to sometimes find exceptions so that you are not falling into rigidity unnecessarily. You cannot build a checklist that can solve all the problems, and you cannot coach your way to containing it all in your head and being able to handle that much information flow that's happening. And as we enter a world where, in my hospital, actually, we're now starting to do genomes typing the entire genome of our patients for every one of our cancer patients. And so the volume of information flow, instead of 40 fact points or decision points in an hour, could be 1,000 that have to be incorporated. And there's just no way that that can be done if you don't have both of these kinds of cultures coming together. Something that is that has the rigidity of a checklist or computer algorithm or that kind of thing, but then for the absolutely necessary component of human decision-making, judgment, and human touch, communication with people, you'll need this, I think, coaching paradigm. Thank you.
I'm a primary doctor. I want to thank you for your writing in the New Yorker, which I envy. I think about the articles I want to write, but of course I'm not doing them. But I did write a book with someone you might know. Tim Galway was one of the fathers of tennis and coaching, and we wrote a book called The Inner Game of Stress and did seminars for about 10 years helping patients. This is very interesting, because if you look at prevention in terms of saving money, it's huge. And if you look at end-of-life issues, which you wrote a good article about, tremendous savings and tremendous humanness that can be expressed in the coaching model with patients, getting them to be able to understand their own intuition, their own understandings is very powerful. We did for 10 years these seminars and then put it in the book and continuing to do that. So the coaching model definitely works at that level of the patient-doctor relationship. It's very powerful.
Well, thank you.
So encouraging you.
There's two interesting things that come out of that. I'm violating my rule of trying to be succinct. Okay, let me try. Tim Gallwey, really interesting. The Inner Game of Tennis, to me, is a pivotal book because it was the early 1970s, and it changed the whole way that coaching was to be understood. And it has influenced lots beyond it. But some of the simplest things about it was that it's a slim book, and it's just this amazing book that, for me as a tennis player, was significant. But the coaching paradigm that it really tried to implant was the notion that people needed to discover their capabilities for themselves more than you needed to instruct them in exactly every component of the technique that they had. You do not teach a child how to ride a bike by telling them that you put your foot 1 inch in front of the pedal on one side and you have the other one on the other side. You have them get the feel and the experience of trying it and failing and supporting them as they begin to be able to do that. And the trick is learning how to make that possible. So in tennis, you can yell at people, watch the ball, or you can help them figure out how to watch the ball. And my tennis coach, using a Tim Gallwey technique, would tell me whether the ball is spinning in a topspin or an underspin as it's coming to you. He didn't tell me watch the ball. He told me, how is the ball spinning? And the ability to ask good questions was the crucial thing. Well, when I wrote my piece on end of life, what blew me away was a woman named Susan Block, who's a palliative care physician, who recognized that there were only 4 or 5 questions that help a patient make the transition from being unable to face a discussion about end of life to being able to have that discussion. And those questions were, if you get sicker, what are your biggest fears about your illness? What are your goals if you get sicker? How much suffering are you willing to go through for a little extra time? Who do you want to be able to make decisions if you can't? And do they know your answers to these questions? And what we've done, in fact, is a combination of coaching and checklists that we put together in a research study that we got funded. Of course, the federal government will not fund anything in this area because of death panels. But we got a private foundation that has worked with us where we're at the Dana-Farber trying to teach doctors to be able to ask these questions. Because in a randomized trial at the Mass General Hospital with palliative care physicians who were very good at doing these questions, in advanced lung cancer patients, the patients who got palliative care along with their oncology care and everything else routinely ended up having less suffering at the end of life. They were more likely to choose hospice, more likely to not die in the hospital, not die in intensive care, not have aggressive therapy at the very end of life. And they lived 25% longer. If it was an FDA drug, it would have been approved. And half of it was an understanding that at a certain point, just taking more and more therapy causes far more harm than it actually helps, and people don't attend to their deepest priorities in their lives. So I think this is a hugely important thing, and will be fundamental as time goes on. Yes?
Thank you for your brilliant speech. You kind of self-criticized in the middle about being anecdotal, and I wondered, are there any statistics on how coaching has worked, either in the medical or in the teaching field? And is anything in the new Health Care Act going to facilitate the gathering and dissemination of statistics?
I cited in the article I wrote this week in New Yorker about as much statistics as there seems to be about coaching that I could find. In the teaching world, it was that set of randomized studies showing at small scale that putting in coaches could take people who, with a workshop, only had a 15% chance they'd actually have those skills 6 months later to better than 80% adopting those skills. But where we are, it seems to me, even in the teaching world, is where there are lots of small examples of successes. School districts, there's more than 100 school districts that have adopted coaching, but there have been failures in some, successes in others, and the successful ones seem to have a mix of things that come together in the way that the principal brings it in, and the teachers don't feel that spies are coming in, and the coaches are recruited well. Picking good people to be the coaches is really crucial. But statistics and large-scale measures aren't quite there yet. But that's how I think knowledge sort of goes along, is that to some extent we want to have lots of studies of some of these things. But also, we need to change faster than we could ever study. And so you try new things. You try to at least monitor and measure whether we're getting better over time. And as long as we're getting better over time, that's we can't ask for more. Over here.
Hi, I'm a surgical resident, so I've read some of your work along my way, and really been impressed with kind of contemplating how we bring the ideas of checklists and other things into the hospital where I work, and thinking about this talk and this idea of coaching, I am surprised that you describe medicine as a teaching specialty where you graduate, because I've always been interested in medicine and surgery because of the idea that it's lifelong learning. Occasionally I'll go to the operating room, and if I'm not prepared, my attending might say, you've got to keep me honest for this. You should have asked me, why is this indicated? And it seems to me that they often try to incorporate some of the ideas that you talk about getting from coaching, from the fact that they're in an academic center working with residents and students.
It is the secret of the academic center. It's in studies over and over again, the academic centers seem to get better results. And it's not clear exactly why, because when you dissect, is it more technology, or is it that people are smarter in the academic centers than others who are practicing, and they just don't show any of it. Whereas the big difference is that you've got students, and students, in the absence of coaches, keep you honest. They ask you questions. They're watching as you go along, and you're constantly trying to drive. You're being asked, how should this person learn to do something? McAllen, Texas, I wrote about. For Medicare, basically the most expensive county for healthcare in the United States, and it's continued to be that way since I wrote about it. And I'm not really welcome there at the moment. But one of the best things that's happened is that there's a medical school opening there. And I don't know why El Paso is half the cost of care in McAllen with a higher quality on whatever metrics that we were able to find. But the culture of the University of Texas, El Paso, the involvement of the medical center in driving care there, you only have anecdotes. We don't have studies to be able to sort these things out. But when I talk to people there, they describe that world that's created by that culture as being very influential. It's an anchor institution in that community, and even though it doesn't have all of the market of the patients, it influences how care unfolds. In McAllen, with the arrival of a medical school and students filtering through into seeing what it's like in the offices and in the operating rooms of that community, my suspicion is that it begins to make a difference in ways that can hopefully help turn things around. I'm going to make this, unfortunately, in the interest of time, the very last question.
Way to put on the pressure. My question is about integration of something like coaching. Do you think that could be best done on more like the government level, especially with all of the regulations for ACA being produced, or more on a sort of hospital by hospital or grassroots physician-based effort?
And I didn't answer that question about how reform might influence these kinds of things. I mean, I'm very leery of having government step in just because I wrote a New Yorker article on this. I mean, I sort of made this thing up, right? So what I would hope comes out of it is that people can take some of the nuggets of the ideas and make it a lot better. You know, there's two ways in which reform really affects what's going on. It's changing the landscape of expectation that that the practice of medicine is financially driven by quantity of care. And it's forcing us to be innovative and really think hard about blowing up a system that was really built around that as the primary financial value. And that is a huge opportunity, but also is a source of instability, and we'll be struggling our way through that. But along the way, if what people have emerging is that you're rewarded for better performance for the sake of patients, then we will all be searching for innovative ways of trying to produce it. And I think we will be cooking up. I think we will gravitate towards things like checklists and coaches and so on, really stealing ideas that have become parts of other sectors of the society into our own world. And I think out of learning what we learn, I really do think healthcare is one of the most ambitious and complex endeavors that we ask a society to pull off. And as we learn in this field, I suspect it will produce lots of lessons for other fields to be able to apply. Government has a role in being able to provide information on how it's going, on fostering more of these kinds of ideas, encouraging research into particular areas, and making it possible for good ideas to emerge and be rewarded along the way. But I would be very nervous if somehow this should be, someone decided to make a law that everybody have a coach. Thank you, everybody, for your morning. Have a great festival.